Nowadays, there really is no such thing as a hidden gem when talking about the most iconic video games of all time. Sure, there are going to be games that you've never heard of, but for the most part, that's because they suck, and therefore are not hidden gems. But the more these classic consoles are talked about in magazines and online, the more good games get recognition, and so they should. Clock Tower, for instance, is a game that 100% fits under this banner. A fantastic game for the right sort of gamer that has a unique gameplay style and atmosphere that few other games can match. The only problem was, for the longest time, it was exclusively sold in Japan, making it almost completely unheard of on Western shores. Which is surprising because over in Japan, when this game was released, it did pretty damn well. But that's okay because nowadays the game is known worldwide with its huge fan base and legacy behind it. Sure, it might not be quite as well known as other horror themed games such as Resident Evil, Splatterhouse, House of the Dead or Dead Space, but the most important part about this series is that, just like all of those franchises, Clock Tower offers a completely unique experience that has left gamers with a chilling experience that few other games for the time could replicate. And that's why I love that a game as individual as Clock Tower is getting more and more eyes on it the more we, as a community, speak about it. Yeah, us Westerners may not have officially got it until 29 years after its original release, but that didn't stop the game being one of the most influential horror titles ever made. Okay, maybe some of those titles didn't take inspiration directly from this game, but I'd bet my bottom dollar that the game they did copy from, in turn, copied from this. But with that said, Clock Tower may just be one of the most polarizing video game series that I've ever covered on the channel. Well, almost. Regardless, I think we can all agree that it's super important to the history of gaming as a whole. But why is that exactly? Well, to answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the creation of this iconic masterpiece to find out what inspired it, what troubles the developer had to overcome to get it made, where did the iconic Scissorman come from, and of course, we'll look into every game that came after too, in Clock Tower: The Complete History. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Our story starts in the year 1990, where a young Hifumi Kyono could be found at college studying economics. Outside of this, in his spare time, Kyono-san was quite the fan of playing tactical and strategic board games, most commonly released by companies such as Avalon Hill. It was here that Kyono-san attempted to create his own game, a card game based around the Yakuza, where you would be brought in as a member of the family, trying your best to expand your reach until you become the dominant force. This card game proved to be quite popular among his friends and family, so much so that he decided to go further down this path into game creation because the reaction he got when people played his game was intoxicating. But with all that said, his opinion was that board games were only good if you had a group of people around you. Video games, on the other hand, which he grew up playing in the arcades, didn't require anyone else. The computer or console itself would become the opponent, allowing everyone to enjoy, no matter how many real people they had, in their top 8. For him, this was the true future of gaming. Now, even though Kyono-san went to college in the hopes to become an accountant, he enjoyed the reaction he got from gamers so much that he decided to buy up several gaming magazines in order to get the addresses of multiple game developers so that he could apply to be a video game developer. Because, hey, why not, right? Kyono-san had already taught himself the programming language BASIC to a pretty decent degree, so you can imagine his excitement when in 1991 the game developer Human called him in for an interview. Now, supposedly Human Entertainment was a very different place to work than the average game developer, whereas the competition would have multiple groups of several people, all with different jobs and talents working with each other to create multiple projects. At Human, the company was set up so that all of the coders were in one section, the artists in another, sound design in another, etc, which caused huge rivalries and arguments between the multiple groups, which in Kyono-san's mind actually helped with game development, as each group tried to prove that they were better than the others. The only problem was, the vast majority of games released by the company up to this point were bog standard sports games. And I only say it like that because that's how Kyono-san saw it. Obviously, I'm taking nothing away from the oh-so-popular Fire Pro Wrestling games, which were one of the company's earliest successes. Still, like FIFA and Madden these days, they were churned out just a little too often. It's also worth noting that a lot of these games, the majority of the games put out by the company, were made by students as part of the game design course that the company held. And obviously, this was where they got their best staff too. It was the perfect game-making machine. Think of that what you will. Thankfully, after several years of success in this arena, the higher-ups at the company started up an internal competition for another style of game to be produced. Multiple entries came in, but as you may have guessed, it was Clock Tower that was chosen by the top dogs put forward by Hifumi Kyono himself. Now, it's worth pointing out that this was quite the risk for the company because you had a couple of other games, SOS and Fireman, two incredibly impressive and unique games that are well loved nowadays, but at the time didn't exactly set the world on fire. No pun intended, as one game requires you to put out fire from a top-down gauntlet-like perspective, and the other tasks you with escaping a sinking ship that actually rotates with glorious Mode 7 capabilities. Sure, they're not exactly all that great to control in this day and age, in fact they're incredibly frustrating at some points, but they showed that the company was willing to try new things and release games that, quite frankly, were wildly different than what was available at the time. And it was games like these that Kyono-san used as inspiration when pitching his game. His vision was to create a horror game, obviously, but unlike the popular horror games that I mentioned before that were either gory for gory's sake or just told a horror-like story in an RPG setting, Kyono-san wanted to create a game that replicated the feeling you would get from watching a horror movie. The feeling of dread, not knowing where to go or what to do, and when the scariest parts of those movies actually happen, that feeling needed to be replicated for the gamer too.
Originally, when I would come up with an idea for a project, I would often break down the structure of a film, anime, or novel that I liked. I would then extract what it was that I found interesting and why, and then structure it out. So when I created Clock Tower, I drew from what fascinated me about horror films like Phenomena and Suspiria. The suspense of being chased and the thrill of hiding from a killer while holding your breath. Neither of these aspects existed in video games at the time. That's why I felt it was worth depicting them.
Kyono-san was a big fan of horror. Movies such as The Exorcist and The Omen shaped the sort of game and the feeling that he wanted to bring to his video game. But of course, it was the movie Phenomena, also known as Creepers in some territories, that had the biggest effect on the eventual Clock Tower game. A film created by Dario Argento, an Italian film director, that released this plus several other cult classics at the perfect time. Italian horror didn't mind jumping around from genre to genre, and within the scene pumped out some of the most iconic movies that have shaped horror for many years to come. This particular movie, which featured a much younger Jennifer Connelly than you're probably used to. Those that have forgotten, there's Labyrinth, Top Gun Maverick, Requiem for a Dream, and obviously Hulk. Actually, I wouldn't blame you for forgetting that last one. Had all of the elements needed to make a game exactly how he wanted. From the inspiration of the main character herself and the bad guy with the big scissors, it all came directly from this movie. It was obvious it was going to be scary, but again, what wasn't so obvious was how he planned to translate that feeling into the gameplay itself. Even though the game was greenlit, Kyono-san had only been with the company for 2 measly years, which means he didn't really have much authority over those other groups that, in quite a few instances, didn't believe in him. Trying to convince an already rather divided workforce to create a game where your only means of attack is to, well, not attack at all, but instead run and hide, was an extremely difficult thing to convince them on. Even the game Alone in the Dark, which served as inspiration for this title, gave you the option to fight back. But here, you run, and you run very, very slowly away.
I had to ask some people nicely if they could help, and tell others assertively to do as I say. That's how we completed Clock Tower. There was one member of the development team who was particularly defiant. They would openly say, "This game is boring." But the moment the game came out and was released to critical acclaim, they started saying, "I worked on this."
For those that don't know, Clock Tower is a point-and-click adventure game with all of the pros and cons that go along with it. For classic horror and point-and-click fans, it's a no-brainer, but for everyone else, your mileage may vary. The game is also incredibly slow-paced, with large sections of the game finding you just walking around aimlessly with nothing to accompany you besides the sound of your own footsteps. That may sound like a bad thing, but this game's main weapon against you isn't the guy with the scissors, it's the suspense. If you go in with an open mind and want to replicate the feeling of your favourite slasher in 16-bit form, then this is the game for you. Of course, with this game mechanic being used multiple times to perfection, it's not going to have the same impact it once did, like it did in 1995. Especially when you work out the best way to hide or dodge from Scissorman can pretty much be replicated throughout the entirety of the game. But still, that doesn't take away from the importance of Clock Tower. As stated, the main inspiration behind the atmosphere found in the game came from the movie Phenomena, but the inspiration for Scissorman himself came from the 1981 slasher film
The Burning.
And finally, Kazuo Umezu's comic God Left Hand, Devil Right Hand, which may just be the most graphic comic or manga, whatever, that I've ever read, in which one scene in particular shows a large pair of fabric-like scissors cutting a cheek from the inside.
In the original Clock Tower series, the scissors have a strong impact on the player. I wanted to create a sense of dread, of slow pain. The pain you feel with a knife or a gun is instantaneous, but with scissors, you feel the blades closing in, coming right against your flesh, taking their sweet time to finish the act. What I really wanted to express was the duration of pain.
Okay then. Surprisingly, this game had absolutely no issues getting onto a Nintendo system. But then again, that may be because, unlike the source material, this game isn't that gory. You don't see heads flying off or huge spills of blood and guts, and that, like the best horror stories in every medium, is what makes it stand the test of time. Have you ever watched a horror film or played a horror game and then several years later, when you watched it again, it wasn't as gory as you remember? That's what Clock Tower is. It cuts away at just the right time. It leaves you to fill in the gaps in your own mind, the chilling story, the spooky setting, the occasional jump scare, and of course the excellent sound design is what forces it to leave a lasting impression on you. And just like several other human games, this title is perfectly created for the Super Nintendo. And look, hey, even though I'm a Mega Drive / Genesis boy at heart, this game will only work on a Super Nintendo due to its incredible sounding, but still crunchy sounding, eerie soundtrack. It just cannot be replicated on any other system for the time. A true classic of the entire horror genre that should not be overlooked. Other games may be similar, or to be frank, more up your street than this, but still, this is truly something special. After Clock Tower's release, we got a couple of ports. Firstly, to the Wonder Swan, which is a modern, capable port of the original, although it really doesn't offer anything to newcomers in this day and age, outside of some gorgeous box art. And then of course you have the PlayStation port called The First Fear, Again, besides the occasional graphical change up and the tacked on cutscenes, it is once again the same game. For me, I prefer the slightly crunchier and muffled sound of the Super Nintendo original, plus the effects that are unique to the Super Nintendo version make that release far more iconic for me. It's kind of like watching an old black and white movie with a perfect sound and a CGI intro. It just doesn't feel right. The original is and will always be the best way to play it. That was until we got Clock Tower Rewind, which provides both versions with a few little extras thrown in for those that want to experience everything those originals had to offer, including a beautifully animated intro sequence too. Going back to 1996, PlayStation owners got themselves Clock Tower 2. But over here, it was just called Clock Tower because the original wasn't released on Western shores. Yes, it's another one of those franchises. It gets even more confusing when you realise that this sequel came out before the PlayStation port of the first game. Still, at least it makes sense as to why they called that first remake First Fear. Anyway, Clock Tower 2, as stated, it came out in 1996. And yes, that means they only spent 1 year developing this game. And if you ask me, it shows. Or maybe it doesn't. After all, Clock Tower 1 was a game made by a team that were very used to what the Super Famicom could do and therefore made a truly brilliant game that took full advantage of the Super Famicom system. And Clock Tower 2 was the first ever polygon-filled 3D game that the studio ever worked on, so of course, it's gonna be a little rough around the edges. Now, supposedly the team did want to go back to making yet another pixelated style game, but for whatever reason, that didn't happen. Still, if you can get past the clunky looking graphics, it's still a good game, far more story based this time if that's your thing, but overall, again, it's the same style of game. Run and hide when you hear the music start to creep in and solve all of the usual obscure point and click puzzles that you're either gonna love or you're gonna hate. Look, I don't want to hate on this game, I really don't, but sure, retrospectively, the game has aged quite badly. I'm not the biggest fan of point and click games in general, but the basic story, the detail and the soundtrack or lack thereof of the original still feels great all of these years later. And I'm not someone that grew up playing this, so it's definitely not nostalgia. The closest comparison that I can make is it gives off those same eerie and spooky vibes that a game like Super Metroid does. It really is a true classic for the Super Famicom. But here, I don't know, there's fun to be had here, sure, but from a historical point of view, it just feels more parody than anything else. And hey, let's not forget, games from this era can be scary. This was the same year that Resident Evil came out. Or if you want my personal PS1 jump scare, how about the T-Rex appearance in the original Tomb Raider, which again also came out the same year. With that said, there is a lot to like about this game. The mouse support, if you have it, is a decent improvement over the SNES original, which didn't work with that system's mouse, which is obviously a shame. And the game is significantly faster paced than before too. Not punishing you for running, which in a game like this sequel, I personally think works in its favour. Also, with the ability to now be in full 3D, this gave Kyono-san the chance to change up the camera angle to better replicate the perfect jump scare as you play through the game. Clock Tower 2: The Struggle Within came out in 1998 on Western shores, which was obviously not the name they gave it back over in Japan. Over in Japan it was called Clock Tower Ghost Head. A spin-off of the series, Ghost Head would go on to be the final game created by the company, but this time, Kyono-san was no longer involved. In Human's defense, they did offer the role to him originally, but he turned it down because in his mind, he'd already pushed Clock Tower as far as it needed to go. This required the studio to pass the duties on to another team, and once again, in their defense, the game was made, not so much as a sequel, but instead a spin-off. Straight away, the game has had a significant upgrade in graphics from the last game, and the controls are somewhat better too. Unfortunately, and I suppose I should say spoiler alert here, but Scissorman isn't in the game. Yeah, just imagine the Nightmare on Elm Street films without Freddy Krueger, or the Halloween films without Michael Myers, or the Chucky films without... you get the idea. Technically it works with the plot of the games, but that's why Kyono-san said no. When you take this sort of iconic stuff out of the game, what you're left with is an overly complicated mess of a point and click that offers little to nothing new to the player, and in fact takes quite a lot away from it. It's as forgettable as a horror-based point and click can be, with a progression system that is an absolute pain to play, as you kinda need to play through the game as two people at the same time, swapping between them, each of which progress the story in their own way. All you do in this third entry is just run until hopefully a cutscene appears which triggers something else in the house, and then you gotta rinse and repeat, and then when that doesn't work, and it doesn't always work, do it all again with the other character because that may be the character that triggers the cutscene. Not only does it make you want to go back and play the original, it gives you far more appreciation for the previous sequel too. The only positive that I've got for the game is that one of the characters is voiced by Roger L. Jackson, who just so happens to be the voice of Mojo Jojo from the Powerpuff Girls. Why did I add that in? Oh yes, he also voices Ghostface from the Scream franchise. Far more relevant.
This isn't a comedy, it's a horror film. People live, people die, and you better start running.
I sadly cannot recommend this game in any way, shape or form. It's an absolute drag and only completable in a remotely enjoyable way if you have a guide helping you along. It's just simply way too cryptic without. Which finally brings us to Clock Tower 3. A definite improvement for the series. This time the game was created by Capcom along with Sunsoft, who had purchased the rights to the Clock Tower franchise after Human went under after some dodgy business decisions outside of gaming. Or at least that's what Kyono-san claims to have happened in an interview. Regardless, as much as the game was a lot better than the previous entries, that's really only because Capcom was involved. The game feels significantly more like a Resident Evil game than anything, with you now controlling the character as opposed to the cursor with a fixed camera angle, aka everything else Capcom released at the time. Again, the end result is pretty decent. The only problem is, if it didn't have Clock Tower on the front cover, I would have no clue that this was a Clock Tower game. Plus, as this was like so many other Capcom titles for the time, it's hard to recommend this over their other releases. Perhaps that makes this a true hidden gem of the genre. Yeah, not really. Clock Tower 3 sold bad, like really bad. Capcom expected to sell 450,000 copies, but upon release, that being early December 2002, the game sold 78,961 units, making it the 151st highest selling game upon release. By the end of 2003, that figure went up to 122,022 units, which was still crazy short of the projected sales. Still, I gotta say, I don't mind this one. Take away what you're expecting, that being a clock tower game, and what you have is a pretty decent action horror game, the likes you would expect with a stupidly over-the-top story and even more stupidly over-the-top voice acting. If you like these sort of games, go in with the right mindset and you probably won't be disappointed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Besides that limited run re-release that I mentioned earlier, nothing has really come from this franchise. And like so many titles before it, all of the nostalgia comes pretty much from that first game. And I suppose the PlayStation follow-up. That original game did something special. Sure, it's not for everyone, it's probably the most polarizing horror type game that I've ever covered. In these times, you're far more likely going to find someone that is confused by what you actually need to do in a game like this. But once again, give it some time and you will have a game that is not only unique, but incredibly influential. You can see how impactful a game like this has been on the genre as a whole, and even though it did have a few misfires and confusing follow-ups that are, to be frank, better left forgotten, that original is a bona fide classic horror game in every single sense of the word. Not bad for a game that never even came out over here in the first place, right? A slightly less censored version of this video is available to supporters of the show, along with my very next complete history, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, which does include some exclusive footage not available anywhere else on YouTube, and the very next Kick Scammer video, Kickstarter's Robot Scandals, a video where we look at the absolute worst robot-themed campaigns from crowdfunding sites such as Kickstarter and Indiegogo. All of these videos, plus many, many more, are available only to supporters of the show, some of which may never go public. You can check all of these videos out right now, like all of these awesome people do, before they go live, and like I say, some of these will never go live. So yeah, a massive thanks to all of the supporters of the show. However you do decide to support me, if you leave a comment, share this on social media, whatever you decide to do, I can't thank you guys enough. Now, this is the part of the video where I give a massive shout out to all of my supporters. Yeah, no matter where you come from, but an extra big shout out going to Andrew Dalton, Bram Perez, British Video Game Nerd, Chev Matic, Chris aka Brackman, Conrad Constantine, To Action Saxon, Dina, Insidious Bliss, Jay's Manchild, Jabba Al Aiden, James L007, Jeff Mianowski, John Yaskatis, I think I'm saying that right. Keiju Samurai 1985, Livestream, Mike Fallon, Nicholas Bertner, Paul Float, Retro to Next Gen aka Lou, Richard Algic, Robert Ramsey, Ryan Burford, Shadow Dragon, Swift Justice Peterson, The Sneaky Ferret, Vida Zavanes, Ye Old Hamburglar, Thomas Coyote Baxter, Will Woodall, Livestream, Dina81, Kamatora Villarreal, I think I'm saying that right, Terracuda, Enraged Gecko, JM Akatimo84, Ian Quell, Arista, Mind of the Unsane, and XZX. Thank you guys so much for all of your support. Yeah, plenty of videos coming up, and guys, yeah, I hope you stick around for them. Yeah, there's quite a lot coming up for the channel, got some brilliant videos in the works, and I'm going to end it there. Much love, guys. Hopefully I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.